Wanted, Moral Courage in Social Work. I'm Kimberly Wilson, co-chair of the Public Relations Committee for the Saskatchewan Association of Social Workers. We are pleased to host this webinar with the Canadian Association of Social Workers. I'd like to begin by letting you know I'm here in North Battleford, Saskatchewan at the Ministry of Social Services office, which is situated on Treaty 6 territory. I also acknowledge that our members live and work on the lands of Treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. The province, now known as Saskatchewan, has long been home to the Plains Cree, Woodland Cree, Swampy Cree, Dakota, Lakota, Dakota, Saulteaux, and Dene First Nations, and the homeland of the Métis. As social workers, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and are committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So a couple of housekeeping notes right to start off with. Everything you need to know can be found in the blue and white icons at the bottom of your screen. Your screen is completely customizable, so take a few minutes to rearrange your screen, which is best suited to you. The handout icon is where you will find the slide presentation. Our webinar will be 1 hour in length. Dr. Blackstock will present for approximately 45 minutes. We will have time for questions at the end. You can post your questions in the Q&A box. Our presenter today is Dr. Cindy Blackstock. She is a member of the Gitxsan First Nation. Cindy is honored to serve as the Executive Director of the First Nations. She has over 30 years of experience working in child welfare and Indigenous children's rights, and has published over 75 articles on topics related to reconciliation, Indigenous theory, First Nations child welfare, and human rights. Cindy was honored to work with First Nations colleagues on the successful Human Rights Challenge to Canada's inequitable provision of children and family services and failure to implement Jordan's principle. This hard-fought litigation has resulted in hundreds of thousands of services being provided to First Nations children, youth, and families. Welcome, Dr. Blackstock. We are honored to have you with us here today.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here with all of you. I'm just going to get my camera going here. There we are. So Huckleberry and I join you from unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa, Ontario. And, there's a lot of talk right now about systemic discrimination. Finally, there is some openness to engage in this very courageous conversation that is for far too long been one that's been put in the back pages of newspapers, or maybe doesn't even appear in the public parlance at all. And even if we did talk about it back then, we'd often talk about it as an international issue, not as a domestic concern in Canada. The type of discrimination that's systemic that I'm going to be speaking about today is arguably amongst the most dangerous. It's when governments themselves perpetrate systemic discrimination. Or as a non-Indigenous child told me, they perpetrate discrimination in a way where they say to First Nations children, "You're not worth the money." A lot of people still don't know, even in our own profession, that the federal government funds services on reserve that are ranging from everything like water, education, early childhood, child welfare, etc., have done so since Confederation, and do so at very low and inequitable levels. Sadly, despite there being so many reports, including by some social workers, this has not been a top issue by the social work profession, nor has tackling probably the most racist act in the government, the Indian Act. These things don't register on the social work kind of agenda in a way that they ought to, given the harms that they perpetrate. So one of the things that I think is really essential in the profession is that we talk about things like systemic advocacy, and we talk about advocacy as being a central thing for social work, but we don't train people to be morally courageous. And what do I mean by morally courageous? I mean that social workers stand in the winds of the discrimination. They stand in the winds of the oppression in ways where they will take a personal or professional hit from those very powerful forces that would like to continue that type of behavior and create vulnerabilities, particularly for children, but for others as well. You know, I remember a poster that said social work, advocacy. And I wondered when were we ever a part of any major social movement? So we need to ask ourselves whether or not we're prepared to take a hit for people that will never know us and never know to be thankful to us. To me, that is in the DNA of what it should be to be a professional social worker. And to get there, we need more people to join the movement and to continue to press against the federal and provincial and territorial governments until this apartheid-type public service delivery ends in Canada. And one of the things that I think we don't necessarily do is really, I'm just making sure we're on the right side. I'm just going to go back. Is talk about, wow, that's kind of odd. Let's see, okay, here we go. Is really talk about the importance of equity. It's the closest thing we have to a silver bullet in social work. The reliable research around the globe, but indeed here in Canada, shows us that if you reduce inequalities in your own society, akin to the ones we're talking about between First Nations children and other children, you would have a whole wide array of positive outcomes relating to improvements in persons' mental health, reductions in things like diabetes, reductions in poverty rates, increased educational rates, trust in communities, reductions in children in care, and amongst young persons who are incarcerated. All of this is possible by reducing those inequalities. Those inequalities often arise out of government policy. And what we've not been very successful at is maintaining in our sights this type of inequality and advocating strongly with government so they implement the solutions that are on the books. This particular report is from the Pan American Health Organization, and it's focused on persons who are of Afro descent and also on persons who are Indigenous. We wanted to take the very Western determinants of health and look at them within the worldviews of those two populations in particular. And you can see in this model that is led by worldwide expert Sir Michael Marmot that we have incorporated things like the land, and we've also mentioned climate change, but those are two very different things, and I just want to take a moment just to emphasize that. So for climate change, that's really a Western concept because people are worried about the environment to the degree it poses a threat to them. But for the land, that really is a recognition that for Indigenous peoples, we are of the land. We are part of it. And so it's really vital that that be incorporated in a concept of the determinants of health. So I just really want to recommend for everybody to look at this report, look at the equity research, become familiar with it. Because far too often in our profession, what we do is we codify structural discrimination as a parental risk. We have all kinds of structured decision-making tools and therapeutic interventions at the level of the person, but what we need to get better at is actually addressing that systemic discrimination that piles up on the hopes and dreams of people. Now, another kind of flawed argument is that governments aren't doing better because they don't know any better, and what we need are more studies. I'm a big believer in evidence. However, what I've learned through this case is that we too often do not look backwards to see what the government knew when it knew it and what it did with the remedies that were being put forward. With regard to the inequalities of First Nations children, we can track it back actually 113 years, where the government's own chief medical health officer raised the alarm about the inequalities in healthcare for First Nations kids and the resulting deaths of really startling death rates. 25% of kids in residential schools were dying back in 1907 from preventable causes. Canada, and here's the piece, they did not fail. They chose not to invest the money that would have saved those children's lives. And we see this pattern repeating over and over and over through history. And one of my regrets is that I wasn't a very good student of history when I first entered into the national conversation about Canada's child welfare funding. What you see before you are three different reports. The one on the left-hand side was really my introduction to being a part of these studies with Canada to document the inequalities in First Nations child welfare. We found as a collective, including Raymond Shingoose, who many of you know from Yorkton Tribal Council, we found that back in 2000, the federal government was underfunding children's services by about 22%, despite the higher needs in child welfare. We also noted that these jurisdictional disputes, these fights between the feds and the provinces, were resulting in First Nations kids being denied services. What did the feds do? Well, they welcomed the study. They said they'll look at it, they'll review it, and then they did nothing. And then we had another study. And by then, the gap had grown to 30%. That's the middle report released in 2005. And by then, sadly, we had the tragic passing of Jordan River Anderson. Here for a moment, I just want to make a point. Please use his full name, Jordan's Principle. Do not use an acronym JP. It is for a spiritual reason related to the community, so please use Jordan's Principle. It's to call his spirit forward. So, and then we have the Auditor General coming up and saying, look, you know, your funding formulas, Canada, are flawed and inequitable. And still, Canada didn't do anything. So sometimes when we get asked to do these studies, we need to really ask ourselves, especially given our code of ethics, whether we're being used in a manner that allows government to have the appearance that they're doing something while they actually don't change things on the ground. The next piece is to look at the reasons why First Nations kids go into care. Remember I was telling you about the broad sweeping nature of these inequalities. Well, we know that the overrepresentation is about 12 times for First Nations kids. And I want to emphasize that here it's important that we disaggregate. We don't use the word Indigenous because there's very different rates of overrepresentation and very different rates of interventions that need to be done to tailor to the needs of those kids. So we're looking at 12 times the rate, and we're looking at poverty, poor housing, and substance misuse related to mental health and domestic violence being the big drivers. So you could tailor up a very nice child welfare program, but if you don't address those inequalities, that child welfare program, whether it's under First Nations jurisdiction or under other jurisdiction, will be built on quicksand because you're not really dealing with the drivers of that overrepresentation. I want to turn next to some new data that's just been released by the amazing team at the Canadian Incident Study led by Dr. Trockmay and Dr. Fallon and others. This is data, for those of you who aren't familiar, that starts from the point of a report of child protection to the point where they're talking about what happens with that case. So we're only dealing with reported cases here, and we're only going to show you data that relates to First Nations children. And this is an important piece, especially as we begin the conversation around C-92, is the vast majority of the substantiated cases are off reserve. So, and that is because we've had, I really feel, a forced migration off reserve because of the underfunding of services. People don't have housing, they can't live in their communities, so they have to go off reserve. But this will be very important when we look at what the federal government is prepared to fund on and off reserve. And it requires that these other services off reserve are really tailored much better to the needs and realities of First Nations families. I'm just going to go to the next slide. And we're starting to see here that some of these functioning concerns are really echoed in previous studies of the CIS. We're getting at those structural issues that families find themselves in. So I really have a serious concern about the continued use of structured decision-making tools, because I don't think that they've really been well tested to really demarcate where are the structural risks versus those risks for which a person has responsibility to change and accountability to change and the ability to change. So we see that in, let's see here, just go to the next slide. For some reason, it's not going forward for me, but That's okay. We're all in this together, right? And you can see that even at the level of children, that a lot of the multi-generational effects that have happened for kids are also of that structural nature. So it's really vital that we actually get in the weeds and address these types of inequalities for First Nations kids. Because if we continue to codify it just at the level of children and families, providing things like parenting courses, therapeutic interventions, etc., we're really, in my view, doing a disservice, because we're not getting at the real risks that put those kids in concerns as well. Now, we talked about the government inequalities, but there's more to the story. I worked off reserve in child protection for about a decade, and I would often use things like food banks, shelters, domestic violence shelters, and especially just fun things for kids. I mean, you know, sometimes we do these therapeutic interventions, but sometimes kids just really need to just be kids. Well, it turns out that that's another area where there's significant underfunding. So what happens is that what we call the voluntary sector or nonprofit sector, that is a large group of organizations all over the country. A lot of money that goes to what we call the voluntary sector or nonprofit sector comes from provincial and federal governments. But what we know, just even in terms of lived experience, is that very little of that gets service to the First Nations children on reserve. So just think about how few food banks you've seen on reserve, despite the fact that there's such big food insecurity, or very little housing relief, despite the high housing crises. So these First Nations kids, if you look at the three sectors, they really have a very profound discrimination happening in terms of accessing services. In none of those realms is it consistent. And so we have to really redouble our efforts and widen our lens when we look at the inequalities. And this next slide just gives us a little sense about how much money we're talking about here. It's well into the billions of dollars. And this problem has been going on for at least as long as I've been looking at it. My early work in 2000, I did a review, and I really could only find just a handful of cases where a First Nations kid on reserve was receiving any services in the voluntary sector. Sadly, back then, a lot of people thought, well, the feds are taking care of those kids. We don't need to go on reserve, or we're not funded to go on reserve, so we're not going to go on reserve. And then on reserve, there wasn't the supports to develop these particular organizations. So it was this inequality that drives this overrepresentation. It actually would be surprising if we did overrepresentation to the degree we are. If I were to apply the same level of circumstances to kids in downtown Toronto or Regina, I think after just a series of a few weeks, we'd start to see families really begin to struggle and make coping with kids at home during COVID look like a luxury trip, because it is so profound to get less at every porthole that you go through, especially when you're trying to deal with the multi-generational trauma from residential schools. So it was Canada's choice to not implement the solutions and not remedy the causes of the overrepresentation that led for the Assembly of First Nations and a Caring Society to turn to litigation. In 2007, we filed a human rights complaint alleging that Canada's failure to implement Jordan's Principle, which is for First Nations kids to get the help they need when they need it, and the inequalities in First Nations child welfare, those were racially discriminatory. By the time the final arguments were heard in 2014, Canada had brought 8 procedural orders to try and get it kicked out on technicalities. It had also been found by independent judiciaries to have violated the law on at least 3 occasions. That's before the final arguments were heard, and the decision comes out in 2016. So this is a very landmark decision. And it really found that the Canadian government is racially discriminating against these children. that their failure to provide equitable services, particularly with regard to prevention services for families, was driving that overrepresentation and creating unnecessarily family separations to a scale not that would eclipse even residential schools, right? So when people think about residential schools as being in the past, the real challenge is for us right now. It's also the opportunity. Now, I want to also say that, unfortunately, when Canada got the order and they welcomed it, they didn't do anything. And as we sit here, we are at 19 non-compliance and procedural orders against the Canadian government since 2016. Keep in mind the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out in 2015 and listed equity and child welfare and Jordan's Principle as the #1 and #3 call to action. And the Prime Minister agreed to adopt all those calls to action. So we had all of that kind of contribution from residential school survivors and the TRC to be a bedrock for Canada to do better, but they did not do better. What we do know, in some good news, is that the number of First Nations kids on reserve, according to the Department of Indian Affairs data, is slowly trending down. And that's thanks to the good work of First Nations child welfare agencies over the years. Where the trends are stable or increasing is generally off reserve. But there is much more that we need to do here, because even if we get it down to like 10 times more likely to go in care, that's not satisfactory. But there is some good news happening around how First Nations are now finally taking advantage of some of the prevention dollars that agencies have received since 2018. The other thing we're looking at is I've really, over this last 25 years, became aware that money drives practice. And there are some fabulous economists out there. The late John Loxley, is a shout out to him. He helped us in the Wande reports. And we turned to the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy to really look at how do we remedy this discrimination by Canada going forward. And one of the things we did is we actually convened a group of First Nations experts for children and came up with well-being indicators that are generated by the communities. And then work with IFSD and with the communities to develop a funding approach, not a formula, but an approach that drives the money towards those indicators, instead of hinging on arbitrary bureaucratic assumptions. This type of work is something that I think is really exciting to look at for all of us in social work, and to really understand how we can work with economists and others to really reform programs by the way they're funded. So I just want to give you a shout out to that, and hopefully we see government adopt it. It's certainly something that we'll be pushing hard for. And the good thing about this model is it adjusts for jurisdiction. So you could be a First Nation drawing down your own law and use this, or you could have partial jurisdiction, or you could be under provincial jurisdiction. You could even be a non-Indigenous agency and drive towards these well-being indicators. So it's a very exciting kind of new thing happening here. Now, on Jordan's Principle, thanks to several non-compliance orders, and a huge shout out to Jordan's family and his community for pressing forward, we're starting to see some real progress being made in terms of Canada providing services for kids. But I really want to kind of emphasize that when we look back at the data, what it's showing is 67% of individual cases and 87% of the group approvals for Jordan's Principle are for formal equality. Well, what do I mean? Other kids would get the service without having to even apply to Jordan's Principle. So what we're seeing is Jordan's Principle starting to plug the holes in these other underfunded services for the federal government. And we don't think it should be that way. So we worked with leadership as well as with First Nations agencies, and we developed something called the Spirit Bear Plan. And that Spirit Bear Plan is about to cost out all those inequalities, everything from water to sanitation, to children's services, to child and maternal health, domestic violence, anything that touches on the lives of children and youth, and figure out what the big gap is. How much are these kids truly being shortfalled? And then develop something like the Marshall Plan after the Second World War to address it. Canada has refused to adopt that plan. That tells you just about everything you need to know, right? Is that they are not ready to treat these kids equally. So what's changed? Well, it's totally been worth it. We have had over 800,000 services given to children in Jordan's name all over the country. And the child welfare budget has now doubled. And actually, we just received another order that will increase that by hundreds of millions of dollars, particularly for children in the Yukon and in British Columbia, where there are communities that are served by the province and not by a First Nations agency. So it has been worth it, and I think that the biggest gain has been the increased awareness amongst Canadians about this discrimination. I remember when I was starting to speak with the press about this case, and a lot of people would say, well, isn't the Chiefs getting the money and just not spending it properly? That was the kind of go-to, because people were so unaware of the way that federal services were being funded, and they had such deeply embedded stereotypes that was their way of understanding. Now we're at a point where not only First Nations folks, but also non-Indigenous people, including children, understand that this is a choice by the federal government to give these kids less, and that is unacceptable. We have to make sure that everyone in our circles understands that and is an active agent in redressing that. So the Spirit Bear plan, there it is. And I'm certainly going to, just like in the last election, I actually printed out a bunch of copies and I left them on my front, bench by my front door. And every time an elected official came knocking, I said, what is your position on this? And I have to be honest, none of them knew about it. And I said, I'm not voting for anybody who doesn't support this. So get back to me. And that's something that all of you can do, right? Regardless of political party. This racial discrimination as fiscal policy should not be tolerated under any political piece. This is just a fundamental issue of fairness and a fundamental issue of doing what's right for kids. So here's, in the midst of this, we get C92, right? I'm just going to go back. Okay. So one of the things that's happening right now is we're getting C92. And it's very interesting to see how the federal government's actually using C92. It's actually using it against the kids in litigation. We are going to federal court on June 14th to the 18th, 2021, to deal with 2 judicial reviews that I'll speak to in just a moment. And Canada is citing the C92 in its own defense. That is very problematic, right? When it's weaponizing an act that's supposed to protect children to, again, perpetuate misdeeds against children. And that's just one of the quotes. And one of the things that they're now saying is that if you are a First Nation and you draw down jurisdiction, you are no longer going to receive the benefits of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders on First Nations Child and Family Services. We say that's unacceptable. We say that First Nations ought to be given an opportunity to make a choice about whether or not they want those protections within the program, and it's within the First Nations Child and Family Service program where those rights are protected, or if they want to do something else. But that something else should be an improvement upon the orders. It shouldn't be backsliding into the way that things have been done in the past, particularly given the consequences for children. We have been trying to get Canada's position on these orders and on C92 for over a year. And it wasn't until we had an employee of theirs under cross-examination that we were finally able to get the confirmation you see below. So what is required in terms of clarification for C92? There is a whole pile of stuff that we don't know about what Canada is doing with C92. I absolutely believe in self-determination, but I also know that First Nations need to have clear disclosure about what Canada's positions are so they can make the best decisions about what's workable for them. What we're seeing is that the government is saying, well, the province will pick up the tab for kids off reserve. And yet there's no agreement by the provinces to do that yet. And I have been around along where I've seen both of them just put their hands up in the air. And so if that's not secured, then that would mean that a First Nation would find it very difficult to serve on and off reserve under their own legislation. It's also very unclear what the funding approach would be for on reserve and whether Canada would be bound by that. We've seen in the past that Canada would say, oh, as a good gesture, we'll fund you at X. But then in a few years, they might pull that back. And there's no guarantee of that. The other thing that I'm worried about a bit is something akin to the announcement on early childhood education. I was so thrilled to see that announcement in the federal budget. But then when taking a closer look and being advised by people who are much better at looking at budgets than I am, they noted that there is no healthcare funding for the provinces in this budget, meaning the highest costs of COVID have gone to the provinces. The provinces don't have the money to pony up their half of the childcare. So it looks good because the federal government's saying we're launching a national childcare plan, but it's very unlikely that in practical terms, because of what Canada's set up in terms of the funding issues, that childcare plan will become a reality. And so we don't want to see that with First Nations families with C-92 either. So we have two judicial reviews we're dealing with, two orders that came down from the tribunal. One is to deal with compensation and the other is to do with Jordan's principle. So in 2019, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal found Canada to be willfully and recklessly discriminating against these children. And what it meant by that is it took note of the multiple opportunities that Canada had to know what it was doing was harmful, knowing what the harms were, and still making the conscious choice to continue to shortchange these kids. And they said that under the Canadian Human Rights Act, these children who were in child welfare care, as well as those children denied services under Jordan's principle, and in some cases their caregivers, ought to receive $40,000. Now that's a maximum amount that they can award under the Canadian Human Rights Act. And it does not stop at all these families from doing an individual litigation through a class action or something else. Well, that was just, for those of you with good memories, you'll remember that was right before the last federal election. And the Prime Minister came out and said, well, we'll compensate them, but we don't want to compensate them under the Canadian Human Rights Act. So they filed a judicial review. And that means we are going to federal court, and they are literally arguing, and I find this very, very dangerous on behalf of the federal government. They're arguing that because this is a case of systemic discrimination, there is no compensation owed to individual victims of the discrimination. That would mean, if we take it kind of in an international context, if we look at the murder of Mr. Floyd, he was clearly a victim, but also a victim of systemic discrimination. Canada's saying is that those victims of systemic discrimination are not owed individual compensation under the Canadian Human Rights Act. It's unthinkable that they're willing to set this precedent, this very dangerous precedent. Canada also did not want to compensate the children who died during the course of this very long case, 14 years. Canada said, we didn't pay the children the estates of children who died in residential schools, so why should we pay the estates of children now? I just found that just kind of a shocking argument, especially in my view. If we look to criminal law, if you are a multiple offender against a lot of children, you're going to be looking at a harsher penalty than someone who just did it once. And in the case of Canada, they're a repeat offender. They did residential schools, the 60 scoop, and now this. And yet they're still saying that we should not have to pay under the Canadian Human Rights Act, that the Canadian government saying, leave it to us, we'll work out some compensation deal in another way. So that's one of the judicial reviews. The second one is Jordan's principle. In November of 2020, the tribunal ordered that First Nations children who are recognized by their nations but don't have Indian Act status should be eligible for Jordan's principle off reserve. Canada says no. Only children registered under that colonial Indian Act ought to be eligible. We say the Indian Act's racist, it's colonial, and it's amazing they're making this argument as they are applauding themselves for passing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples through Parliament. It just went through third reading yesterday. But they're arguing against these children, and they don't want them to get the help they need, or at least they want Canada to be free of any legal obligation to provide help for these children. So this is a very important thing for you to be aware of. Now, this is just another example of how they are linking their arguments on Jordan's principle to C92. And you can see in this paragraph, this is Canada's Factum. You can find the whole thing on fnwitness.ca. You can see here that they're saying, well, if we're bound by this order, it could set a very difficult precedent for the government of Canada. Per C92, we might end up having to pay for these kids off reserve. So it's not just conjecture that Canada is fighting this order on Jordan's principle to try and shield itself from a financial accountability for First Nations children, no matter where they live. Canada itself is making that perfectly clear. One of the most heartwarming parts of this whole story, and that's why Huckleberry is here, is that children were amongst the first to come to the hearings. We have a campaign called I Am a Witness that we launched because we really feel discrimination thrives in darkness. And in order to really deal with it, you have to bring it out into the light. So we have this campaign called I Am a Witness, where we load all of our documents in court, all of Canada's, and we ask people to make up their own minds. When we first launched that, very few people signed up, other than friends who I knew supported the cause and First Nations, but very few organizations, and I'm sad to say very few social workers or social work organizations signed up. Back in 2007, we got feedback that people thought it was too political, and I said, of course it's political, because it's the government doing the discrimination. It's not partisan, but it is political, and if you want to do systemic discrimination, you got to stand in those wins. So in the early days of the courtroom, it was often empty. It was First Nations folks, and we were dealing with Canada. But that all changed in 2009 when children started showing up. And children started to fill the courtroom. Children of all diversities who had not normalized the discrimination that Canada was meting out to First Nations children. They could see clearly that this was wrong, that you cannot just give another child less because of their race. And they wanted to be there. They wanted to listen to all sides of the story. And by 2012, there were so many children coming, we had to book them in shifts. And we had to move the whole hearings to the largest courtrooms here in Ottawa. So there would be all kinds of school buses pulling up. And these children were younger children, and, from usually about 12 or so. And then teenagers started showing up. And they have been, I think, the real people who were able to awaken us from our slumber as a profession, but also as generations of adults who had normalized this for far too long. So as a gift back to these children and to inspire other children, we work with the amazing Spotted Fawn Productions to create an animated feature that tells the story of the tribunal. And from the perspective of Spirit Bear. Now, I have his uncle Huckleberry here, but we actually have Spirit Bear gifted to us by Carrier Secondary Family Services. And he was actually at all the hearings. We brought him there to remind us all that this was about children. And that's where our accountability lied. And until things changed for them, we needed to keep on doing our work. So you can watch this video by getting a hold of us. It's beautifully done. I had no idea. I mean, I thought that animations these days were done by computer, but everything that you're seeing in that scene is handmade. So they're handmade puppets. To shoot 13 seconds took them a full day. So I'm just going to play a video now about some of those kids who came to the courtroom. It's just a couple minutes about things that you can do in May and June to really become part of the solution, along with the Spirit Bear plan. Hopefully this works. I don't know if it's running for me or not. There's a technical person who can help me out. That would be great. Doesn't look like it. So what I'll do is, oh, sorry, I can't hear you.
I had myself muted.
So okay.
Actually, we can play it. I might go back one slide, and then individuals just have to click the play button on the screen. If you wanted to show it, we could do that.
Yeah, if you can click it, because the screen's looking very small for me, so I can't see the play button.
For sure. Why don't I do that?
Perfect.
Great. Go here, and then we'll go here. Just press that play button on your screen and unmute.
Reconciliation is
I'm not sure it's working for people. You know what? We'll leave it till later. We'll do some fiddling around on this. But it's really, I think it's a real credit to how much kids understood who come to those hearings. And they will be coming again. We'll actually have a whole session with youth in care and other young people across Canada on June 11th to prepare for the hearings, so that we can answer their questions, we can be held accountable to them, and we can help them understand what's going to happen in that courtroom. You will also be able to watch those hearings. And we would really recommend to social workers that you tune in as much as you're able to, June 14th to the 18th, 2021, and that you use social media to broadcast your views, that you're an active witness in this thing, and that you use every opportunity to promote full equity for First Nations kids and a proper implementation of C-92 that is not using self-determination to offload government responsibility. So this is how to get a hold of us. You can follow Spirit Bear even at Spirit Bear. We have all kinds of educational resources for social workers, for parents, for children, and all kinds of ways that kids themselves can get involved in peaceful and respectful ways, but that make it very clear that this type of discrimination is ongoing, it needs to stop, and that the benefits for First Nations children, and indeed all people in Canada, really cannot be calculated. It will just be such a wonderful day when we finally put it behind us, Canada's woeful treatment of First Nations kids. So, you know, and for those of you saying, well, you know, they can't afford it. Well, I think COVID-19 has taught me one thing, and that is that the government has been spraying money everywhere. I didn't even know we had all this money. So it was always possible for them to treat First Nations children equally. And there's absolutely no excuse for in 2021 to be saying to a child, you're not worth the money. All kids are worth the money. They're all sacred. And frankly, they're the best investment any government can make. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Wazelenka, Executive Director of the Saskatchewan Association of Social Workers, and I'm going to moderate the Q&A portion of this webinar. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Blackstock, for your inspiring talk. You covered so much ground and gave us so much to think about. I certainly have lots to learn and lots to reflect upon when I think about our profession. I'd encourage everyone to send your questions in through the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions in. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. I just want to mention that Dr. Blackstock isn't able to address any specific case questions, but certainly we've got a number of questions that have come in. But I want to start off with a question. And as social workers, we often work in systems where change is really slow and difficult to influence. And so, Dr. Blackstock, as a social worker, how do you get through those difficult moments in your career when you feel like change just isn't going to happen, or you know the hill seems so high? How do you deal with it or get through those times?
First of all, I realized that not only was I able to go to university, but I was not captured up in the residential schools. And I have the opportunity to be a social worker because people before me struggled so that I could have those opportunities. And I am always so grateful to those people who made that possible. It seems to me to only be right that in my time that I'm able to pick up that baton and work in a company of others to make those opportunities even better for kids coming forward. An elder gave me a great piece of advice a while ago. He said, never fall in love with your caring society and never fall in love with your business card. Only fall in love with the children. And that really has key because we've had to put a lot at risk for this case. We've got all of our funding for our organization cut. We're completely non-government funded at this point. You have to go all in this stuff. And what I've realized is that when you're working in alignment with your values, the values that call us to social work in the first place, when you're not compromising that, when you're working from that ethical space that really centers, in my case, First Nations children and their families. Yes, the work is hard dealing with systemic discrimination, but I don't need a lot of self-help programs because I have the freedom and the comfort of knowing that I'm able to act in moral integrity. I find when people are in situations where they're having to compromise those values in the name of being practical or other types of things, that's when the erosion happens in terms of your spirit and your well-being. And that's where I find a lot of people really have a hard time. So I really encourage people to get into trouble for doing the right thing and to be really act in alignment with those values. And that means you need to have the moral courage, because courage is not a value in and of itself. It's an activator of values. It's a real question of whether or not when the chips are down, are you prepared to stand up and be counted?
Great, thank you for that. It's the idea of good trouble, right? Yes, thank you. So another question that we have is, can you clarify more around the use of the word Indigenous? And the question is when to use or not to use. I feel like it's being used increasingly in our work lately, new cultural connections plans and throughout Bill C-92. And I know that you mentioned that, so could you clarify a little bit about use of terms?
Yeah, you know what? My position is to use First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. I use that whole phrase when I'm talking about all three groups. I have been around enough to see a lot of labels given to us that we're supposed to be excited about. So Indian was the first one, then came Aboriginal, then came Indigenous. And maybe because I'm so old that when Indigenous came around, I thought I'm going to take a second look, because the idea was that this somehow was more Indigenous, this term, than Aboriginal was. But the reality is, if you look them up, they're both have Latin derivations. They're both Western world words, and they mean roughly the same thing from the beginning. If I have a choice between Aboriginal and Indigenous, for me personally, I'd rather use Aboriginal because that's protected in the Charter under Section 35 for Aboriginal rights and title. This word Indigenous, it's really questionable of actually what it actually means. And I try to really respect that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities are distinct between and among them. And so you're far better off to use First Nations, Métis, and Inuit and avoid the term Indigenous if you can. That's my personal view.
Great, thank you. The next question is, I'm a former child protection worker. What can we be doing to advocate for families and support those workers whom are still in this field to enforce changes?
You know, I did frontline child protection work for about 13 years, 14 years. And it was the most difficult and also one of the most rewarding jobs I ever had. And I just want to say a shout out to all the people who are on the front lines. They often get a lot of negative press, And I don't think that they get the recognition that they ought to get for the important work they're doing. I will say that one of the things I always challenged myself to do is when I walked into it with a family, I would ask myself, what here can this family reasonably change that is posing a risk to this child? And then what risks are actually sourced in public policy? Because I think too often we go in there with we see the poverty, we see the mental health issues, and we just treat it at the individual level. We send people to parenting courses when what they really need is a new fridge, right? And a new washer and dryer. When you're a young parent on a low income who lives with, has got 3 toddlers, right? A washer and dryer, I think, is often a better intervention than sending someone to parenting classes. Reduces family stress so much. So I think, asking yourself the question, what does the family have control over and what don't they? And then tailoring your interventions that way, and realize that you're not going to be alone dealing with systemic issues. We are working nationally to address those. You can get behind them with the Spirit Bear plan, watching this case, signing up for I Am a Witness, writing to your member of parliament, to your member of the legislature saying you have to implement these things, educating yourself on C92. You can do all that stuff and be part of a larger movement to deal with the systemic cases. But really try to avoid as best you can. And I put this out to therapists too, because I think therapists often sometimes miss this opportunity, is really look at what that person can really change on their own and provide the intervention there, but also be really aware that you don't want to codify this stuff, the structural stuff, and land it in the laps of kids and families.
Good, thanks. A comment that the video is great, so I think that there was some viewing of the video.
Oh, terrific.
The question is,
yeah.
It looks like you could play it individually. So wondering if there's a fact sheet that we could create and provide to correct stereotypes and help people move forward in this important work to have equitable care and access for all.
I really recommend that regional organizations do that. You know your community's best. We have all kinds of resources on the Caring Society website, individual information sheets. We have, if you go on Spirit Bear, if you type Spirit Bear and Caring Society, I'll bring you up to his page. And he has written books about true stories about how children have stood together to address the discrimination in education, child welfare, etc. And those all have learning guides and learning tools that you could even use for daycare kids. But I have used actually the animation in post-secondary. The other thing you can do is on the National Film Board, there's 2 free documentaries. One of them is called We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice. That takes you inside of that hearing room and you can watch us all testify. You can see me testify, folks like Raymond Goose testify, and then you can also see the witnesses on the government side testify and make up your own decision. So We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice, free on National Film Board. The other documentary you can watch is Jordan River Anderson, The Messenger. That tells the story of Jordan River Anderson, a little boy who gifted us all with Jordan's Principle and the struggle to get Jordan's Principle recognized. So it's another great documentary that's out there to help inform your community work.
Great resources, thank you. A question about where we can access the equity study. I'm not sure if, I don't have the slide in front of me, so I'm not sure if it was referenced on the slide, but where could we get hold of the equity study?
I'm going to try and go back there. So you can go to the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO it's called, and I believe the website is paho.org, and it's Just Societies and Dignified Lives. Okay. And I'd really recommend that people also check out the work of Michael Marmot. He is from the UK, and he led the study. but he's also done studies for the World Health Organization and a lot of research on the whole question of health equity. And when I use the word health, I don't mean just like, you know, doctors and nurses. I mean it on a very broad understanding of that, a very holistic kind of health piece. So social workers, I think, would find this research really, really interesting and very helpful to their practice.
Okay, next question. How well do you think faculties of social work across Canada are doing at being both facilitators and role models for the idea of moral courage in social work practice?
Variable, but not very good. I don't even think a lot of faculties teach it. And they don't necessarily teach equity or advocacy skills either. I'm fortunate. Actually, I just finished teaching a graduate course for social workers and lawyers. I bring them, our law students, I bring them in together to teach them about advocacy because I think they need each other. And I would love to see a lot more emphasis on moral courage and the discipline it takes to do advocacy well. In the course that I teach, I actually spend the majority of it talking about how to manage yourself. Because movements are most often defeated by those who are leading the movement and part of the movement. You start to act in ways where you want to be right versus do right. You act in ways that take you away from the values that you're standing up for. For example, you can't stand up for human rights while you violate human rights. There's lots of things that people will do just walking into these spaces thinking you're advocating without really reflecting on the serious type of discipline it takes to be able to do it in a way that brings dignity to people. I would love to see moral courage being a core course, and not only just in the first year, but throughout social work education, because moral courage takes practice. You know, I always say to people, I want you to think about when you were morally courageous. And I also want you to think about those times in your life when you were a moral coward, because we've all had them, right? Mm-hmm. And to be just make yourself really aware and conscious of when you are hearing something where it's clearly an abuse of someone's human rights or dignity, and you know that there's a personal risk for you, but you step up to the plate. What are the circumstances around you doing that? And then when does it happen when you're not in that situation where you let it slide? And there's a great YouTube channel to help you practice. It's called Moral Courage, and it's on YouTube. Just Google it and you'll find it. There are vignettes of people of all walks of life who are morally courageous. So you have to practice moral courage in your families, in your workspaces. I found it personally, it's a lot less stressful to live your life with moral courage than it is with moral cowardice. Because the greater you are with moral courage, the more in alignment you are with the values that brought you to this work in the first place.
I'm sure we're all going to be checking out YouTube at 1 o'clock on for the video on moral courage. That's a great resource, and you know, in social work programs, we talk about advocacy and the importance of advocacy, but it's a very good question about, are we prepared to do what needs to be done and how to do it, right? A similar question. Here another question about Bill C-92. Hi, Cindy. You were talking about how our communities can have their own agencies and legislation under Bill C-92. I'm wondering if there has been any funding tagged onto Bill C-92 designations, or is it still up to the individual communities to fund these agencies if Bill C-92 designation is obtained? It is a funding question.
And it's a very good question. The problem is we don't have a clear answer from Canada. And what we need to see is a lot more transparency from Canada so that First Nations can make clear and informed decisions about this. What we know so far is that the funding that they're providing for C92 is to develop your laws and do community consultation, but they have no funding, for example, while you're developing your law, and under the Act it can become a law within a year. They don't have any funding in there for developing services and programs. So you can effectively have your law without the ability to be able to implement it, which is very concerning, right? Then the question becomes, how do you secure the type of funding that you'll need to get and make sure your kids have full enjoyment under those laws? And I always just say to folks, look, just go in there with your eyes wide open. We have been litigating against these guys for 14 and a half years. We're going to court on 2 major cases this month. So just be really, really aware of what's going on and look behind the rhetoric and ask some really important questions. We're working on an information sheet right now on some of the questions we have about funding. And at a minimum, I'm going to make those public in about a week or so that others can ask those same questions. The other piece around it is to look at the work of Hadley Friedland, Naomi Metallic, Corin Lightning Earl, Sarah Morales. Those are some First Nations lawyers who are doing some fabulous work analyzing C92 and looking at the opportunities as well as the risks. So take a look at some of their work.
Great, thank you. We'll be watching for that. Sorry, we can't get to all of the questions. It's just a little past 1. I do want to just answer very quickly a question that the webinar is being recorded, so it will be available after. And I'm going to pass things back to Kimberly so that Kimberly can do the closing.
The entire time of your presentation, and definitely inspired to discuss morals in social work and regarding advocacy. So thank you very much. Just a reminder to everyone again that this will be saved and posted on the SASW website.